Well, shocking statements from a Border Patrol whistleblower delivering a bombshell statement to Congress that cuts to the heart of the immigration issue, and lawmakers, they don't want you to hear it. I'm Ben Swan. This is Truth in Media.
The United States federal government is the world's largest child sex trafficking organization in modern history.
Well, that was former Border Patrol Agent J.J. Carrell, and he is not exaggerating. He spoke to Congress this week about an immigration system that is broken at its core. And yet those in power refuse to take accountability, including for the fact that over 300,000 children in the last 3.5 years have come into this country and are missing today, meaning no one in Washington, no one around the country knows where they are. This is readily admitted, and yet no one's doing anything about it. And instead, lawmakers want to talk around this massive issue and the harsh realities that it's created.
If they want to help us get the hell out of the way, we're going to do it. If I got to send twice the amount of resources to that city, that's what we're going to do.
And the bickering isn't going to end anytime soon. You just heard President-elect Donald Trump's border czar, Tom Homan, sending out a stern message to lawmakers after Trump seemingly confirmed on Monday that he does intend to declare a national emergency and use the military to assist in his plans of mass deportations of undocumented immigrants. Congress has granted presidents broad powers in the past, certainly, to declare national emergencies at their discretion. But some lawmakers in cities like across the country, like New York City, and cities across Arizona have agreed that they will help.
They want politicians to treat the border as more than a convenient place for a photo op. They want leaders who will take action. Protecting our border is not a Republican or Democratic issue. It is an Arizona and an American issue.
But there are also some lawmakers openly saying that they will actively thwart and defy the president's orders. Boston's mayor is saying that her city will not cooperate and instead will protect immigrants in, quote, every possible way. She's just one of the latest lawmakers to say that they will try to protect their states from the policies of the incoming administration. What someone needs to tell them, though, is that any effort to thwart the president's actions should be seen as active efforts to thwart the will of the American people, therefore undermining your vote. Joining us now to talk about it is Cristian. He is the founder of The Last American Vagabond and a man who knows a lot about this issue. So, Ryan, thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, my pleasure, Ben. Thanks for having me on.
So let's talk first of all about this kind of planned resistance, right? It's so interesting to watch the election as it played out. We heard so much talk about how Harris was going to win. All of a sudden, Trump not only takes the electoral college vote, but he also takes the popular vote. And a lot of the things that he has called for in terms of immigration especially was a major part of his campaign. And now we see the so-called resistance, which is going to be different governors in some states. It's going to be mayors in certain cities who say, we're not going to take part in this. And yet the overwhelming vote by the American people, and by the way, not just in red states, but across the country, was to say, we've got to resolve this issue of 20 million immigrants who came here in the last 3 years.
Yeah, it's an interesting, there's a lot of different points to include in this, and I'd like to start out by simply making sure people are aware of my opinion around the voting dynamic in general. And I think I'm of a mind that I don't think our vote is translating to the outcome like it may have once done in the past. I think that's just important to highlight. I think everyone has an opinion about that from some level, but it tends to get ignored at certain partisan interests. But playing into this conversation or leading into the conversation as you said, that this, the Donald Trump's administration has a mandate. The American people have stated that they want what he's putting forward. So looking at it from that perspective, it's important to highlight that the back and forth of the two-party paradigm is always used this way. And I think first and foremost, it should not be a discussion about whether the law should be upheld, right? Unless we're making this a broader concept about whether there's unjust laws in place, which is something we should be having as well.
Sure.
But the idea to simply say that an illegal immigrant the law should not be enforced in regard to somebody who's here illegally because of a political dynamic. That is a core issue that we need to address in this country in general. That happens on both sides of the paradigm, that when it suits their interest, they choose to overlook a law that they don't agree with. And we all know that's not how that's supposed to work. So first and foremost, the law should be upheld. But what I worry about is how even within that there can be abuses from either side. But in this case, the Republican side of, let's just say, initiating a national emergency, using the military, which those are separate conversations, really, enforcing the law around illegal immigration and then using the military and national emergency to enforce something that should have already been done through the normal channels, and actually could, by the way. So there's two sides to that, and I'm worried about both, quite frankly.
Well, I think that's a reasonable position to take, first of all, that there's an overreach on both sides. And one of the things I think we see happening with the Trump administration, or the incoming Trump administration, is going to be a push to overcorrect. So you've had the last almost 4 years now, where the laws were completely ignored, and you have this flood of people who have come in. So the overcorrection now becomes, well, let's bring in the military to sweep them all out of the country. And yeah, well, I agree with you. Both are overreaches. What is the solution then to say, how do we get 20-some million people out of the country who shouldn't have come here the way they did? Not that they shouldn't have come at all, but come in the way they did, and then to remove the ones, especially, people who were released from prisons in Venezuela, people who are obviously part of gangs from Venezuela and from other South American countries, or, military-age males who have come here in the last 4 years. How do you find those people and remove them? I think it's a very complicated issue.
It most definitely is, but I think it's important that we're there. Even within that, there's nuance. There's debates about whether that story is accurate. There's a lot to get into there, but I think there's two parts to that main question. Is that first, obviously, the overcorrection, you could argue, is necessary. I mean, I can see, and ignoring for the minute the kind of used nature of both sides of how that's continues. It's interesting to highlight that you could argue and logically, that you can agree with the logic around it, that you have to make a step like this because the other side is playing it the same way. So the idea that just executive ordering everything is where we that's our government at this point because of how that works. So I get the drive, the feeling that it's necessary to take that because that seems to be the only logical way to get what you want done. But I think we need to, even saying that happens in this moment, we need to really step back and have a larger conversation about not just the immediacy of the problem, which in a way is sort of dealing with a symptom as opposed to the actual problem, and address the fact that our government dynamic has allowed these things to be like this for a very long time. We tend to like to focus on one side versus the other when those suits our interest. In some cases, it's almost always slanted, but there's a much bigger useful problem that never stops when we're continuing to allow more government to be the answer to things that we don't necessarily need. Well, as usual, the government causes the problem, and then more government is the solution. Now, even if they actually see that as the necessary point now, that's a problem that cascades going forward. And so, yes, to the immediacy of it, there needs to be law enforced. Now, I would simply say that if you have a position where there are things that are not being enforced, where the law is constitutional, that's important, and not being upheld, well, then we just need to enforce that problem. Hold people accountable who are not doing what they're supposed to, not jump over the top of that and cause more government, more authoritarian control to circumvent the person who's just not upholding the law the way it should be. That's kind of the issue. And so, but then from the broader point of it, we need to start addressing how both sides tend to use these open gaps to allow more of that control, and a lot of times just more personal interest. I mean, Gavin Newsom is a perfect and horrible example of what happened during COVID-19, of what we would argue was very much in the line of the larger agenda, but that he abused in incredible ways for his own personal enrichment. So there's a lot of that goes on. And I think during that time, it was more slanted to the left. But as I see right now, I'm beginning to see more alarming trends toward the right in that same overreaction, even if it's justified in the moment.
Yeah, no, I totally understand that. Let's talk about this issue, though, because when we talk about the border, I feel like we can't have any conversation about it without addressing what J.J. Carrell, that former Border Patrol agent, said there, which is he says the United States government has been involved in being the biggest human trafficking operation on the planet. And one of the issues with that I think is so critical is the underreported issue of more than 300,000 children who have been brought into this country that are missing and no one knows where they are. What an enormous scandal that is. In my opinion, one of the greatest scandals of all time, to be able to say there are 300,000 children who came here and no one knows where they went. There's no record of them. And at some point, you talk about government, big government is not the answer to solve government's problems. Totally agree with you. But there has to be some accountability, not just in terms of saying, well, let's get it right now, but let's also bring accountability for those who allowed children to be brought here and no one knows where they are.
Absolutely. But I mean, it speaks to the same problem. And first and foremost, I wholeheartedly agree that this is an issue. And even more so with the bombastic but accurate claim about the idea that the U.S. government is facilitating this. I don't think that should not even be a contentious statement. But for a lot of people, it's just, it's too much for them to take in right now, because it highlights a bigger problem, that it's not just, like, I guess the same point we're making, that how are you going to go to a government to solve a problem that is the facilitator of this problem? But see, this is where we get into the left versus right idea, where it becomes, well, it's only one side that's the problem. I can flat out prove that's not true. Going back a very long way. I mean, Dennis Hastert himself, second in line to the president, was deemed a serial child molester, during Bush administration. So it's not one side or the other. Now, it can slant different times, but the issue itself is overwhelmingly obvious. And if we get into the partisan dynamic of it, it ultimately allows the problem to keep continuing. We just need to uphold the law itself. And if it comes down to a politician or a person on the border or a random person involved, the law is very clear. I would even argue flat out state for sure, we do not need more laws or more government action. We just need to enforce what's currently there. And I think this is abused by a lot of different people on both sides of the paradigm and the companies they're involved with. Sure. And of course, the foreign policy dynamic. During the Syrian war, for example, I'm sure you saw the reports of the overwhelming amount of children, the same dynamic that they just went missing. And so in this country, if we have that many people missing, I find it impossible to believe that's a one-sided paradigm issue. But again, the law has to be enforced.
But it's absolutely not a one-sided paradigm, right? This is not a left issue or a right issue, but it is an issue of the permanent bureaucracy that has no accountability in anything that it does. If you made the statement, you called it bombastic claim that the United States government is also the biggest weapons smuggler around the world, I think you could also accurately make that as well, right? The problem is there's no accountability for any of it. So when these things happen and 300,000 children go missing, or when we allow, U.S. military to fire rockets into Russia to drum us up towards World War III before Trump takes office, there is no accountability after the fact for those who made these decisions. We don't know their names. We don't know who they are or where they are or what happens to them after the fact. They just go on and live off their pensions, and there's no accountability. And I think that's the other issue. It's not just an issue of going back and saying, well, let's enforce the laws we have. It's if you are in a position of power and you allow these kinds of things to take place, why is there no accountability? You can clean up a lot of the problem by holding those who are instituting these policies accountable. I'll give you the last word here.
Oh, you make an excellent point, and this comes to the crux of the issue, right? It's easy to say enforce the law if there's no enforcement mechanism that's going to do so. So I wholeheartedly agree, and that's where we have to come down to. I mean, look, if you believe that going through political action, voting for an election is going to cause that to change, I'm 100% with you. I tend to find that there's much more political. There are better avenues to take to affect change in that way. And if it comes down to the people of the United States simply digging our heels in and not allowing the dynamic to continue, regardless of what paradigm side is saying, what other, pointing at the other. The bottom line is that we as the people can no longer allow this to continue from either side or internationally with the U.S. government's involvement, funding, whatever else. And it's time for us to stand up and make that clear, whatever president's in position.
That's right. It's not an issue of party. It is certainly an issue of policy, and it needs to be fixed and cleaned up right away. Ryan Cristian, thanks so much for joining us, man.
Thank you, Ben.
And that is our show. You can catch all of our latest coverage. Check us out on X at @truth_in_media. And you can watch all of our full episodes right now on truthandmedia.com.